Can a person change? No, seriously. Do you think people can change? We don't like to change much. But how hard is it really to change? I thought we should try an experiment in the sermon today. I'm going to try to change my delivery. And I'm going to fail miserably. As an enacted parable of how difficult it is to change. So here's our experiment. I'm going to try not to be so loud because some of you have been missing sleep. I'm going to try not to talk so fast because some of you have not been understanding a word I'm saying, which is probably good for me. I'm going to try to have a different delivery. I know that some Sundays you're not sure what to think of me because I have a doctorate of philosophy, but I preach like a redneck. There was a lady in my last church that had a real issue with that. She agreed with my theology. We were on the same political team, which is actually irrelevant. We were in the same social club, went to the symphony together with other folks, but she did not like my style. She pretended to be my friend, but she talked ugly about me behind my back. She thought that I was not sophisticated enough or dignified enough to be her pastor. She would frequently tell everybody, I miss our last pastor. He was quiet. He read his sermons and he used theological language that had nothing to do with my life, and he didn't meddle in my business and make me uncomfortable. She thought I was not sophisticated. So I'm going to try on her behalf to see if I couldn't actually sound like a person who is educated and sophisticated. But when there's a Pentecostal preacher and an African American preacher living in your heart, it gets hard to be calm all the time. Plus, I'm still a redneck. You can't change that just because you put me in a robe and gave me a stove. Sophisticated clergy, after all, I did a little research, are well-mannered. And I know that I'm sometimes rough around the edges. Sophisticated preachers are smooth as corn silk, and I'm a corn cob. Preachers usually beat around the bush. I have a tendency to set the bush on fire. Some preachers talk in convoluted sentences that never quite say much of anything because they don't want to get into trouble. I say what I mean, and sometimes I do it hoping I will make some trouble. So chances are, halfway through this sermon, I'll release the brakes and fire up the engine and turn this sermon loose. But I'm trying to show you that we can change, as hard as it is. And the reason I'm doing that is based on this story. Because Jesus tells parables for one reason. Not to give you cute little stories, but to tell you that you should change. Parables are change agents, and they're sneaky. They start out with an everyday, ordinary, conventional picture. Something everybody gets, something everybody understands. Everyday people living everyday lives, doing everyday stuff, populates the parables. And then right in the middle of the parable, Jesus sneaks in something from another world, an alternative world, a kingdom of God, something unconventional, something radical, something that changes everything. And today's parable is an example of how parables work. It's an everyday story about an everyday farmer planting his crops, and weeds come up. What could be ordinary, more ordinary than that, here in the middle of the state of Illinois? And then something weird happens. Leave the weeds alone. Nobody saw that coming. I once knew a lazy soybean farmer. Only lazy farmer I've ever met in my entire life. But the guy was lazy. He planted his crop every spring, and as far as I know, that's the last time he checked on it. He didn't do any more plowing. He didn't call up the crop duster to get rid of the weeds. He let the weeds grow, and the weeds grew so high that they covered the soybean crop. You were tempted to stop on the side of the highway and put a big sign, "Please do not cut down these weeds, there's a crop under here." And finally, when it was time to harvest, he would show up again with the combines and harvest everything. Soybeans, weeds, take it down to the soybean combine seller, and there they would give him a stiff penalty for all that trash that was in his beans. But he didn't care. He put the check in the bank and waited till next spring, where he would plant the crop one more time. This story sounds like that soybean farmer. Leave the weeds alone, says Jesus. And we are not at all sure that we want to listen to Jesus. We do not wish to change because we're not in the business of leaving weeds alone. Some of you are probably obsessive about weeds. You can't stand them. Not in your grass, not in your flower bed. You attack them with a vengeance. And here we get someone telling us, let the weeds grow. We do not like it. Now you're probably thinking, well, the reason why this is so hard, preacher, is that you cannot teach an old dog new tricks. We probably believe that. Gardner Taylor said that's wrong. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can teach them to sleep longer and scratch more. But you can teach an old dog new tricks, but usually old dogs don't like to be bothered. Around here, we probably say, we do not need new tricks, we just need some younger dogs. And that's probably the trip that we're on right now. We're not sure at all that we want to be anything like this parable that demands of us that we change something so radical that it would make us a different kind of people. A preacher tells us the story of an imaginary conversation he had with a greyhound that had been racing his entire life and then had been purchased by the preacher's daughter. And he was visiting his daughter one day, and he said, we ran out of much to talk about, so I asked the greyhound, are you still racing? He said, no, I don't race anymore. He said, do you miss the excitement of the track? No, I don't miss it at all. Did you get too old to race? No, I still got some race in me. He said, well then why did you quit? Were you losing every race? No, I won more than $1 million for my owner. So then why did you quit? He said, I realized one day that what I was chasing was not a real rabbit. And I quit. All that running and running and running and running, and what was I chasing? It wasn't even real. One of the reasons we ought to consider change on the basis of Jesus' teaching is that what some of us are chasing turns out not to be real. We just think it's real. But here's Jesus saying there's a whole new life that's possible for anyone who's willing to actually change the way they're living. So I just want to ask you to give this parable a chance. That's all. Just listen to it and give it a chance, and we'll take whatever happens. Now, first, a good word for the weeds. One of my favorite poets is Gerhard Manley Hopkins, and I think some of the most moving poetry he ever wrote is right here. What would be the world once bereft of wet and wildness? Let them be left, oh, let them be left, wildness and wet. Long live the weeds and the wilderness yet. I love that piece. Long live the weeds. Weed pullers, because now we're talking about people, weed pullers make a theological mistake. They assume they are God's rightful judges. They assume that they are in charge. As John Howard Yoder, Anabaptist theologian, puts it, they lay claim to the handles of history and the judgment seat of God. They assume a power they do not possess, an authority that can belong only to God, and they are painfully unaware how fragile their claims are and how deeply implicated they are in histories of violence. But the parable begins with what sounds like an innocent question. Do you want us to gather up the weeds in a pile and burn them? That's our question. You should never worry about whether or not you can figure out where you are in the parable. You are in the parable wherever it makes you go, ouch. That's you. This is me. Do you want us to burn them? Natural impulse. Get rid of the weeds. Someone is always demanding that you got to get rid of undesirables. A senator from Mississippi way back in the day campaigned to do what? Send all the African Americans back to Africa. He said, put them on a boat and send them back. Got him elected governor of Mississippi for 2 terms and a United States sitting senator. Senator McCarthy crusade to rid this country of the communists. He says, I'm going to pull the weeds out of this country. All those pinkos, communist sympathizers, all those people with communist leanings, are you now or have you ever been? They've got to go. And what about those hate groups, the white nationalists who are armed to the hilt, working to rid America of people who are not white? And the truth is, none of us are white. That's white. If I look like that, call the damn doctor. Uh-oh, I got excited. That wasn't sophisticated. There are always people ready to get rid of the undesirables, even in church. We've watched churches do it. We've listened to churches preach it. But this parable tells us to leave the weeds alone. New Testament scholar Richard Hays from Duke Divinity School says that this parable has an interpretation that suggests to us that Matthew's church was having an argument about what to do with the weeds. What to do with the people that are not pure, that are not holy enough, the people that do not meet our standards, the people who do not look like us, the people who do not agree with us. What are we going to do with these people? Should the church try to be an homogenized community made up of just the pure? Or should the church be a mixture of saints and sinners awaiting the final judgment from God? And in Matthew's church, they had a really big fight about this. It was still going on a generation later when an editor of Matthew's gospel added another interpretation of this parable that doesn't concentrate on leaving the weeds alone. It concentrates on gathering them up, bundling them together, and throwing them into the fires of hell. I thought it was appropriate that we had a text today about the furnace and the fires of hell, considering what the temperature has been around here lately. There's something inside of me that said, when I wake up to 97 degrees in Peoria, this ain't right. So Matthew's editors really fired up about Satan and hell. And when this dominates the imaginations of Christians, there are beliefs to defend and opponents to defeat. Enemies are everywhere, paranoia and insecurity, a siege mentality. No quarter is to be given. Lines are drawn in the sand. And God's people become grim judges with their noses bent out of shape. All these weeds, they got to get rid of all these weeds. And the church becomes a religious version of that well-known weed killer, Roundup. It's even a good name, right? Round them up and smoke them. You know, you got weeds growing in the cracks of your sidewalk, get you some Roundup. They'll be dead within 24 hours. And I really hate that that makes me smile. Round up all the weeds and put them in the fire. But judging others and pulling weeds does have a certain self-satisfaction about it, doesn't it? People seem to get a lot out of it. They seem to be happy. You know, I never minded preachers who wanted to preach on hell. What I got scared about was how happy they seemed doing it. Gotta be something wrong in that man's heart. But some Christians seem like they can't breathe, that they're not angry, bent out of shape, or fired up about something that has nothing to do with the gospel. I hear people in the church, or they'll come up to me and go, "Preacher, we have to do something about those people. We got to do something about those people. They're messing up our church." Weed pulling is an addictive habit. If you ever pull one, you won't be able to stop. When there's blood on your hands and you feel the sensation of power, it's hard to break. A nasty habit. Once your nose has been out of shape by righteous indignation, it's going to take more than plastic surgery to straighten it out again. I am convinced that a weed weed-pulling church is a blasphemous organization trying to be God, usurping the throne of grace, and sitting on the seat of judgment. And what does Jesus say? Leave the weeds alone. Did you hear that? Leave the weeds alone. Some folks can't believe it. Isn't there such a thing as right and wrong and true and false? Preacher, don't we need to take a stand? Don't we have to draw the line? Don't we pull some weeds? And the boss says, leave the weeds alone. Now, I've tried to change and I just can't do it. I'm going to have a heart attack if I don't turn this loose right now. Is that okay with you? All right. This is not something Jesus just said one time. I just went back and checked him out this week, looked through the Gospels, and here's Jesus saying, do not judge so that you may not be judged. Do you understand what that means? Does that sound reasonable to you? For with the judgment you make, you will be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Jesus talks plain talk sometimes, doesn't he? Then of all things, Jesus says that pulling weeds does more harm than good. Think about that for a minute. Paul Grove was telling me he had a call the other day about a crop duster that was going to be spraying some soybeans, and it was in an area where his bees are going to be out looking, for stuff that they can make honey with. And they called him to let him know so he could keep his bees safe. Because without the call, the crop duster killing the weeds would have also killed all of Paul's bees. You can do more harm than good when you're in the weed-killing business. I once, many years ago, had a large circular flower bed in my backyard. One that I would see every morning on the way to church, every afternoon when I came home from the church, and it was filled with these beautiful daylilies. They were bright yellow, one of my favorite flowers. And then I noticed that in my daylily bed, there was this particular large kind of grass that was growing up, that the stem of it looked exactly like the daylily. You could not tell the difference. It was like some evil thing had gotten in my flower bed and did it. I almost believed in the devil for the first time in my life as an actual human being. The devil was planting stuff in my flower bed. I would come home from work and I'd be so mad about those grass stems in my garden. I wouldn't even bother to go take off my suit. I'd be out there in a three-piece suit, ripping and tearing and throwing those things. And once in a while I'd reach and pull out a piece of grass, and on the end of what I thought was grass was a big bug. Uh-oh. Rodney was pulling up grass and pulling up his own flowers at the same time, because Rodney had gotten all hot under the collar and lost his temper and hated those weeds so bad that he was doing more harm than good. And the lilies paid the price. I don't think that we ought to ever get anywhere near the kind of people who think that you ought to burn the weeds, because I'm telling you that only God can tell the difference between a weed and a flower. Sometimes what you think is a weed turns out to be a beautiful flower in God's garden. Fred Craddock, one of my favorite preachers, said that he was out in his wife's garden one day, and there was this weed there that had a bulb on it, and it broke loose, and it was pretty, but he was convinced it was a weed. And he reached to pull it out, and a little voice told him not to do it. And he came in to dinner that night, and there was that weed on his dining room table, because it turned out it was not a weed. It was a flower. We can't tell, folks. So why do it? Why do we want to judge other people? Why do we want to get down on people because they look funny or talk funny or they're not like us? Why can't we get around town the word that at First Baptist Church, we're going to practice radical hospitality and genuine humility. Let's pray for God to send rain on the weeds and the wheat and not worry about anything else. I want to return in conclusion to a piece of poetry by Hopkins, in which he prays, "O Lord, send my roots rain, for I am thirsty." If we can concentrate on watering our roots so that the flower we are producing is so beautiful that it will attract others who will want to be in the same garden with us, we'll be a faithful church. But if we slide off into this weed-pulling contribution thing, we're going to be in a mess. So instead of pulling weeds, let's thirst for righteousness. I think it makes all the sense in the world. But remember, change is hard, especially for preachers